The room was so still you could hear the cameras hum. The debate stage, usually an arena of sparring sound bites and clashing egos, suddenly felt like a cathedral of silence. Lauren Boebert stood at her podium, shoulders drawn tight, eyes fixed on the woman across from her, Jasmine Crockett. Moments earlier, their exchange had been fiery political daggers wrapped in smiles. But now, something was different. Boebert's voice, when it came, was soft enough to make the audience lean forward. "I want to thank you," she said, almost hesitating over the words, "for bridging divides, for reminding us that we can disagree without destroying each other." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The moderator blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. A camera operator froze mid-pan. You could feel the disbelief rippling across the studio like static. Lauren Boebert, the face of unapologetic confrontation, had just offered gratitude to her most vocal ideological rival. Jasmine Crockett tilted her head, her expression unreadable. The silence deepened. Then, from somewhere in the audience, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined in. And another. Within seconds, the room was alive, an eruption of applause that felt less like politics and more like release. Boebert gave a small, almost reluctant smile. Crockett nodded, not triumphantly but graciously, a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared humanity. The cameras caught everything, the shimmer of surprise in Boebert's eyes, the warmth in Crockett's. For one suspended moment, two women who represented opposite sides of America stood connected by something far greater than ideology. Social media would later dissect this clip frame by frame. Was it real? Was it rehearsed? But in that instant, none of it mattered. The air itself seemed charged with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, we hadn't forgotten how to listen. The applause grew louder, echoing beyond the studio walls. Boebert lowered her head slightly, as if realizing the weight of what she'd just done. Crockett took a breath, her poise unshaken, her presence luminous. And just as the crowd reached its peak, the narrator's voice cut in, calm, reflective, disbelieving. Moments like these don't just happen. They're born from battles, from bruises, from years of tension ready to snap. But what led to this moment was even more unbelievable. Before the applause, before the stunned faces and soft smiles, there was tension so thick it could be felt through the screen. The night had started like so many others: bright studio lights, polished desks, an audience hungry for confrontation. The chyron at the bottom of the broadcast read, "Bridging the divide. Can Congress still talk?" But everyone watching knew what they'd tuned in for. They wanted sparks. They wanted to see Lauren Boebert and Jasmine Crockett collide. Lauren took her seat first, her confidence radiating like armor. Every movement, every smirk, was a reminder that she'd built a brand on defiance, on saying the things others were too afraid to say. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, calm, poised, her expression unreadable but her presence unshakable. She adjusted her microphone with a measured grace that contrasted perfectly with Boebert's sharp energy. It was the collision of two worlds, the gun rights firebrand versus the law-trained truth-teller. The host smiled too widely, pretending not to sense the tension vibrating beneath the set. Cameras rolled. "Congresswoman Boebert, Congresswoman Crockett, thank you both for being here to talk about unity in divided times." Unity? The word itself felt ironic. Boebert gave a small laugh, the kind that said she knew exactly how this night would go. Crockett didn't flinch. Her silence was its own kind of authority. What most viewers didn't know was that these two had history. Months earlier, a heated exchange in a committee hearing had gone viral, Boebert accusing, Crockett rebutting with laser precision. Twitter had exploded. Memes, late-night jokes, political pundits turning their rivalry into theater. It was the perfect storm of outrage and spectacle. And now, they were seated just feet apart under the hot lights, expected to talk about healing. As the debate began, their differences unfolded in high definition. Boebert's words cut fast and loud, driven by conviction that played to her base. Crockett countered with logic sharpened by years in the courtroom, deliberate, calm, slicing through rhetoric without raising her voice. The contrast was cinematic, where Boebert burned, Crockett glowed, where one sought to dominate, the other sought to lead. The studio audience leaned forward, caught in the rhythm of their exchanges. Each retort from Boebert drew a murmur. Each measured response from Crockett drew quiet respect. It wasn't just politics anymore. It was identity, ideology, the story of two Americas staring each other down across a table. And yet, somewhere beneath the noise, there was something else: exhaustion. You could see it in their eyes when the cameras cut between close-ups. Two women who had been turned into symbols by strangers who didn't know them. Two professionals who had learned that outrage sells, that compassion rarely trends. When the host asked about bipartisanship, Boebert exhaled sharply. "It's hard to reach across the aisle," she said, "when the other side's busy burning the bridge." The audience gasped. Crockett didn't blink. She leaned forward slightly, her tone even but her words carrying the weight of experience. "Then maybe the answer isn't waiting for someone else to build it," she said. "Maybe it's having the courage to start laying the first plank yourself." The room fell quiet for the first time all night. Boebert's jaw tightened, not in anger but in something closer to realization. Crockett didn't push. She just let the silence linger. What the cameras couldn't capture was the flicker that crossed Boebert's expression. A brief, unguarded moment that hinted at fatigue, at recognition. No one watching could have guessed that just minutes later, she'd be the one to extend the olive branch. No one could have predicted who would bridge the divide first. Lauren Boebert's rise wasn't quiet. It was a spark in a dry field. From the moment she stepped onto the national stage, she wasn't content to blend in with the marble columns and polished smiles of Washington. She came armed with certainty, defiance, and a story that resonated with a certain slice of America that felt unseen. The waitress-turned congresswoman from Rifle, Colorado, who opened a restaurant where servers carried guns, wasn't supposed to make it to Capitol Hill. But she did, and when she arrived, she made sure everyone noticed. The media painted her in bold strokes: the rebel, the provocateur, the firebrand who wore confrontation like a badge of honor. In progressive circles, she was the villain of a modern morality play. The congresswoman who tweeted taunts instead of policies, who clashed instead of compromised. Her every soundbite was fuel for outrage, her every appearance a magnet for controversy. It wasn't just politics, it was theater, and Boebert had become the show. She thrived in the chaos, at least at first. Cable networks couldn't get enough of her. Headlines loved her bluntness. Supporters adored that she didn't apologize. In a town built on restraint, she offered rawness. In an era addicted to spectacle, she became spectacle itself. But beneath the slogans and the swagger, there were cracks that few saw. The long nights scrolling through vitriol online. The private calls with staffers trying to put out fires she hadn't meant to start. The moments after rallies when the crowd was gone and the hotel room was quiet and the adrenaline faded. Politics can be a lonely business, especially when your persona demands constant battle. There were whispers within her own ranks, colleagues who rolled their eyes, strategists who wished she'd tone it down. Some questioned whether her fire helped the cause or simply burned too bright to control. And while she brushed it off publicly, there were nights when the isolation stung. She'd chosen this role, but roles have a way of swallowing their actors whole. What few people realized was that Boebert's defiance wasn't just a performance, it was armor. Every sharp word, every viral moment of confrontation, they weren't just political strategy. They were survival instincts. She came from a world where being underestimated was the default. The backlash didn't scare her, it energized her. But deep down, fatigue was creeping in, not from the fight itself, but from what the fight had become. Because somewhere along the way, the debates stopped being about ideas. They became personal, brutal, unforgiving, and even the toughest armor has seams. She'd scroll through headlines describing her as the chaos candidate, the symbol of America's anger, the villain progressives love to hate. At first, she'd smirk: "If they're talking, you're winning." But over time, the words started to echo differently, not as victory but as confinement. The caricature had become a cage. Still, she couldn't show weakness. Not in front of cameras, not in front of allies, not even to herself. The image of the unshakable, unfiltered fighter was her currency. So she doubled down, louder, sharper, more unapologetic. Yet the louder she became, the more the distance grew between who she was and who she'd become. There was one moment, months before the debate, when the cameras caught her off guard. A hearing had turned tense. An aide had whispered something about tone, about empathy, about optics. Boebert had snapped not at the aide, but at the suggestion that she needed to soften. And then, as the room cleared, she'd caught her reflection in the glass doors of the Capitol, her own face framed by the nation's most symbolic building. For a flicker of a second, she didn't recognize herself. But then the doors opened, the reporters shouted questions, and the performance resumed. To the outside world, she remained the embodiment of confrontation, the woman who didn't flinch, didn't bend, didn't back down. To her critics, she was arrogance in human form. To her supporters, she was courage made flesh. And yet, behind closed doors, there was a growing question she couldn't quite silence. What happens when the fire you started starts burning you too? The night of the debate was just another chance to prove she still had control over her image, over her opponents, over the narrative that had built her career. She came ready for combat, ready to dominate another headline. But what she didn't expect was that the very moment meant to reaffirm her persona would become the one to challenge it entirely. Because across the aisle, another woman was building her own kind of fire, one that didn't roar but radiated, one that didn't demand attention but earned it. And soon, their flames would meet in a way that would light up more than just the room. Jasmine Crockett's story began long before the lights of Washington. It began in the quiet grind of Texas courtrooms, where she stood before judges who barely looked up and clients who had nowhere else to turn. She wasn't born into influence. She carved her way toward it case by case, client by client, injustice by injustice. Her voice was her first weapon, her intellect the second. Every argument she made, every motion she filed, carried the cadence of someone who understood what it meant to be underestimated. In those early days, Crockett's sharpness was often mistaken for arrogance. Male colleagues called her feisty, never formidable. But she learned quickly that when power doesn't invite you to the table, you build your own. She didn't just practice law, she wielded it. For her, every courtroom was a microcosm of America's promise and hypocrisy, a space where fairness had to be fought for, not assumed. Her reputation grew. She became known not just as a defense attorney, but as a defender of dignity. The clients others overlooked, the poor, the marginalized, the unheard, became her cause. Her success wasn't measured in money or titles, but in how many people she'd pulled out of the system's blind spots. So when she entered Congress, she didn't come as a politician. She came as a fighter who already knew how to stand her ground without losing her grace. It didn't take long for Washington to notice her. On camera, she was composed but lethal, her words precise, her delivery unflinching. In hearings that went viral, she mastered the art of measured fury, a voice that didn't need to rise to command attention. There was one moment that defined her early tenure. A committee hearing had devolved into chaos, members shouting over each other, decorum dissolving into pettiness. And then Jasmine, quiet until then, leaned into her microphone. Her tone was calm, deliberate, a scalpel cutting through noise. Some of us were raised to believe that service means respect, not spectacle. The room went still. The clip traveled everywhere within hours. Millions watched not for policy, but for poise. Crockett became something rare, a political figure who didn't perform rage but embodied restraint. To her supporters, she was proof that intelligence could be power's most elegant armor. To her critics, she was too polished, too unbothered, the kind of calm that unnerved those who mistook volume for strength. But that composure wasn't passive. It came from fire, a quiet, steady one that had burned for years. The daughter of educators and community advocates, she'd been raised to believe that justice wasn't an abstract idea, it was personal. Every time she took the floor, she carried the faces of those who didn't have one. Every speech was a promise that their stories would be heard even when her own voice trembled with fatigue. Her rise wasn't without its costs. The scrutiny was relentless. Her grace was dissected, her tone analyzed, her confidence spun as arrogance. But where others might have fractured under the spotlight, Crockett seemed to grow stronger in it. She learned long ago that being underestimated was her secret advantage. It kept her sharp. And yet, she never lost her humanity. Staffers would later recall late nights in her office, where she'd work quietly with music playing low, her shoes off, laughter soft between lines of legislation. For all her steel in public, there was warmth in private, a deep empathy that reminded those around her why she'd entered politics in the first place. When she spoke of America, it wasn't in slogans but in stories: the mother balancing two jobs, the student crushed by debt, the immigrant trying to belong in a country that often forgot its own promises. She didn't just fight for them, she saw them. And in a chamber too often ruled by ego, that was radical. It was that same empathy that made her such an effective counter to Lauren Boebert's aggression. While Boebert wielded provocation, Crockett wielded presence. While one thrived on reaction, the other commanded reflection. In debates, it wasn't uncommon to see Boebert's frustration rise as Crockett refused to take the bait. It wasn't that Crockett lacked emotion, it was that she knew where to place it. For progressives, she became a kind of archetype, the unshakable professional woman of color navigating a system not built for her, reminding viewers that poise could be a revolution all its own. Each viral moment carried more than just political weight. It carried emotional validation for millions who saw themselves in her. Calm, capable, yet constantly tested. Crockett didn't just play defense. She redefined what strength looked like in a room that rewarded spectacle over sincerity. She was proof that conviction didn't need to shout, it could whisper and still move mountains. So when the networks announced that Jasmine Crockett and Lauren Boebert would appear side by side on a bipartisan broadcast about unity, the country didn't expect peace. They expected sparks. They expected Crockett's patience to meet Boebert's fire and combust on live television. No one watching that night could have guessed that what would unfold was something far rarer. Not the clash of two ideologies, but a collision of two very human journeys. Because what happened when these two women met again would shock the nation. The broadcast cut back from commercial with the kind of tension you could taste. The host's smile was stretched tight, the audience perched at the edge of their seats, waiting for the next verbal strike. The topic was supposed to be about unity, finding common ground in a divided nation, but the air in the studio hummed with the opposite. Lauren Boebert leaned forward, eyes glinting under the lights. "The problem," she said, her tone sharp, each word aimed like a dart, "is that we keep talking about unity, but one side refuses to take responsibility. You can't bridge divides when the left profits off outrage." A few heads in the audience nodded, others groaned. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't roll her eyes or interrupt. She simply waited, the kind of patience that disarms even before it speaks. When Boebert finished, Crockett's voice came calm and measured. "Accountability isn't partisan, Congresswoman. It's patriotic. We can't heal by pretending one side owns the moral high ground." Her delivery was surgical. The audience shifted, murmuring, caught between admiration and tension. Boebert smirked, the trademark expression that said she was just getting started. Patriotic. I think most Americans are tired of lectures about morality from people who rewrite the rules every time they lose an argument. Her words snapped through the air like electricity. Crockett blinked once. "And I think most Americans are tired of politics that sound like a shout instead of a conversation." That landed. The crowd responded, a ripple of applause that made Boebert's jaw tighten. The moderator jumped in, trying to redirect, but the rhythm between the two had taken on a life of its own. Every exchange felt choreographed by fate. Boebert's heat against Crockett's composure, fire against water. The camera panned between them, the flicker of Boebert's restless energy, the unflinching steadiness of Crockett's gaze. You could almost feel the invisible tug-of-war for the room's oxygen. "Respect in governance," the host said, forcing a smile. "That's tonight's theme. Congresswoman Boebert, do you believe America's leaders still respect one another?" Boebert laughed, short, dismissive, rehearsed but real enough to sting. "I believe some of us try to, but it's hard when others spend their time tearing down what this country stands for." Crockett turned slightly toward her, calm as ever. "Respect isn't about agreeing on what America stands for. It's about remembering who it stands for." A hush. The moderator looked between them, unsure whether to step in or let the moment breathe. Boebert's face shifted, not anger this time, but something closer to reflection, just for a second. Then she fired back, voice rising. "You talk about respect, but what about respect for people who feel left behind by your policies, for the Americans who think no one's listening to them anymore?" It was the first time Boebert's tone cracked, with something resembling sincerity. Crockett's answer came softer than anyone expected. "Then maybe the first step is listening, not shouting louder." The words didn't hit like an attack. They landed like truth. The room went still again, that same cinematic silence from earlier returning, the kind that demands attention. Boebert leaned back, her practiced smile faltering for the briefest heartbeat. The moderator glanced nervously at the producer through the glass. They'd expected fireworks, and they were getting them, but not the kind that could be controlled. A voice from the audience broke the silence. "That's what we want to see," someone shouted, half in disbelief, half in hope. A smattering of applause followed, awkward but genuine. Crockett nodded once, graciously, then looked down at her notes. Boebert's fingers tapped against the desk, a staccato rhythm that betrayed the internal battle she fought between habit and humility. The host tried to steer the discussion toward policy, but no one was listening anymore. Every eye was locked on the two women who'd come to embody the nation's split, one powered by conviction, the other by composure. And then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, just a pause, a breath, the kind that feels like the edge of a precipice. Boebert looked up, really looked at Crockett, and the fire in her expression dimmed. For the first time that evening, her words didn't come immediately. The cameras caught it, the hesitation, the flicker of vulnerability. And then, in a moment no one could have scripted, Boebert lowered her guard. For a long second, nothing moved. The lights seemed to hum louder, the air itself holding its breath. Lauren Boebert sat with her hands folded, her trademark confidence dimmed into something quieter, something human. The moderator tried to fill the silence, fumbling for a segue, but Boebert raised a hand gently. "Wait," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the studio like a note struck clean on glass. The audience stilled again. Cameras zoomed in. Even Jasmine Crockett seemed to brace herself for whatever was coming next. Boebert drew in a long breath, eyes flickering down to her notes, then back up at her rival. "You know," she began, "I've spent a lot of time talking about what divides us. I've made my name on it, honestly." A small, self-aware smile. "But watching you tonight, I think maybe we've been missing something." Crockett didn't move, but her eyes softened in the faintest way. The host blinked rapidly, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. Boebert continued, her words steady but quieter now. "It's easy to play tough, to fight for applause lines instead of answers. I've done that, and it wins headlines, sure. But it doesn't win people. She paused, choosing her words carefully, "you've reminded me that maybe civility isn't weakness. Maybe it's what strength actually looks like." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The hum of the microphones picked up the shifting of seats, the muffled rustle of disbelief. Even the stage lights seemed to flicker slightly, as if leaning closer. Jasmine sat still, lips parted in surprise. The cameras cut to her, then back to Boebert, capturing the moment from every possible angle. Boebert nodded once almost to herself, then looked straight into Crockett's eyes. So I just want to say thank you for bridging divides, for reminding us that we can disagree without despising. It's easy to talk about unity, but tonight you showed it. The studio froze. The moderator looked stunned, his mouth half open as if waiting for a punchline that never came. And then, from somewhere in the audience, a single pair of hands began to clap. Once, twice. Then a second person joined, then another. Within seconds, applause thundered through the room. It wasn't the polite, obligatory kind. It was cathartic, emotional, disbelieving. The sound filled the space like rain breaking a drought. Boebert blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the reaction. Crockett exhaled slowly, the faintest smile forming as she reached for the microphone. "Thank you, Congresswoman," she said quietly. Her tone was steady, but something in it shimmered, a blend of grace and gravity. It takes courage to say that, more than most realize, and I think America needs to see that courage looks different than they've been told. The crowd roared again. The cameras panned across faces, people standing, some with tears in their eyes, phones lifted high to capture history in real time. The host finally found his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, laughing nervously, I didn't have that on my cue card." Everyone laughed, lightly, nervously, with relief. The tension that had hung over the night dissolved like fog burned away by sun. Boebert leaned back, her composure returned, but her expression had changed. There was no smirk now, no steel. Just the faint look of someone realizing they stepped beyond their own walls. Crockett, ever the picture of grace, nodded to her, not as an opponent acknowledging defeat, but as a woman recognizing humanity. The applause kept swelling. The microphones buzzed faintly as audience members shouted words of encouragement. "Finally," one woman cried, "this is what we need." Cut to close-ups, an aide in the wings wiping at her eyes, a camera operator whispering "wow" under his breath, the host glancing to the control room, wide-eyed, mouthing "keep rolling." On social media, the moment was already erupting. Phones streamed live feeds of the broadcast. Within minutes, hashtags began to climb. "Bridge the divide," "Standing for Grace," "When Courage Listens." Clips flooded Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Edits framed Boebert's words over orchestral music. Split screens showed her transformation from firebrand to humbled figure. Comment sections overflowed. "Maybe there's hope after all. This is the America I want to see." In Washington, screens glowed late into the night. Staffers texted each other in disbelief. Commentators scrambled to rewrite their talking points. Even political rivals on both sides found themselves pausing, rewatching, trying to understand what had just happened. For Boebert, the applause washed over like a wave she hadn't seen coming. It wasn't adoration, it was release. The weight of expectation, defiance, and constant combat lifted, if only for a heartbeat. She glanced toward Crockett again. Crockett met her gaze with quiet acknowledgement, a silent message that needed no words. This wasn't surrender, it was recognition. And yet under the applause there was something else, something unspoken, a tremor in the air. Because moments like this, genuine and unscripted, were dangerous in their own way. They rewrote narratives. They challenged identities built on conflict. The moderator tried to close the segment, but the crowd refused to settle. Boebert smiled faintly, leaning toward her mic once more. "You know," she said, her voice almost lost beneath the clapping, "maybe the bridge starts right here." Crockett nodded, "Then let's walk it." For a heartbeat, the studio glowed, two figures standing in the light, applause echoing like thunder, a rare instance where politics looked like progress. Cut to commercial. The music swelled, the logo faded in, but the moment lingered. Backstage, aides scrambled, producers whispered into headsets, and security held doors open as both women exited in opposite directions. Reporters shouted questions, desperate for sound bites, but neither answered. The hallway lights flickered with the fatting echo of applause. Somewhere in that silence, something fundamental had shifted, not just between two congresswomen, but in the hearts of everyone who'd watched. And yet, as the night wore on and the headlines multiplied, no one could have predicted what would come next. Because what followed after the cameras stopped rolling took it to an entirely new level. By dawn, the clip had already crossed 5 million views. The debate hadn't just made headlines, it had detonated across the internet like a cultural supernova. Hashtags flooded every corner of social media. Bridge the divide, standing for grace, when courage listens. The moment between Lauren Boebert and Jasmine Crockett, a single act of humility and composure, had become the heartbeat of a country desperate for something that felt real. On Twitter, the reactions came in waves. Journalists called it the most unexpected act of grace in modern politics. Commentators who'd built entire careers mocking Boebert's brashness now found themselves hesitating, recalibrating. One viral tweet read, "I came for the chaos. I stayed for the humanity." On Instagram, clips of Crockett and Boebert standing side by side filled reels, edited with cinematic music, slow zooms, and captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." Meanwhile, TikTok creators dissected every microexpression, debating whether the moment was strategic or sincere. It didn't matter, the feeling was contagious. Cable networks replayed the exchange on loop. CNN dubbed it the silence heard around America. Fox News called it a turning point in congressional civility. Even late-night hosts, usually gleeful in their cynicism, dropped the sarcasm for a single breath to admit, maybe this is the first real handshake across the aisle we've seen in years. The images became iconic. Crockett's poised nod, Boebert's softened expression, the standing ovation swelling behind them. It was the kind of moment that transcended politics and whispered, maybe we're still capable of grace. Celebrities joined in. Viola Davis reposted the clip with the caption, "Power meets peace." Mark Ruffalo tweeted, "It takes real courage to disarm ego with empathy." Even Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson chimed in, "More of this energy, please. America needs it." And then came the montage. Cable packages rolled out reaction videos, splicing studio applause with viral TikToks, family kitchens, office break rooms, and classrooms, people of every background watching, rewinding, replaying. A grandmother in Ohio teared up watching it with her grandson. A group of college students in Austin shouted, "Finally," as the clip hit replay. The New York Times ran a headline that morning, "When Civility Stood Up, a Night That Redefined Respect." The Washington Post followed. In a divided nation, two women broke the script, and The Atlantic published a long essay titled, "The Moment America Remembered How to Listen." For once, both sides found something to hold onto. Conservatives called it a sign of maturity, proof that even their fiercest voices could grow. Progressives praised Crockett's poise, her ability to lead with dignity without surrendering conviction. And somewhere in the middle, millions of Americans exhaled a kind of emotional relief. Reaction videos filled YouTube, veterans talking about honor, teachers discussing empathy in civics class, teenagers describing how it gave me hope. A pastor in Atlanta said during his Sunday sermon, "If Lauren Boebert can say thank you, then so can we." Political cynics tried to reclaim the narrative. "It's all theater," one pundit scoffed. But the clip's staying power told another story. It wasn't the choreography that people remembered. It was the stillness. The moment when hostility paused long enough for something human to break through. In Denver, a muralist painted the two congresswomen side by side on a brick wall downtown, Boebert in red, Crockett in blue, both framed in a bridge of light. The caption beneath reads simply, "America, take note." The ripple effects weren't just online. In schools, debate teachers used the clip to talk about listening. On Capitol Hill, whispers grew. Other lawmakers privately wondered what it would look like if they followed suit. The moment had turned into a mirror, reflecting the best version of who the country could be. And amid all the noise, both women remained silent. No tweets, no interviews, no press releases. Just silence, which only deepened the mystery and magnified the impact. But behind the scenes, their offices were inundated with letters, from teachers, from veterans, from young girls who said they finally felt seen. Messages poured in with one common refrain: "Thank you for showing us something different." Cable news moved on by the following week, as it always does, but the image lingered. Screensavers, posters, memes of that split-second glance between adversaries who'd chosen respect over ridicule. And still, in quiet corners of the internet, people kept asking the same question: what happened after the cameras cut? Because there were rumors, whispers of a private exchange between Boebert and Crockett once the lights dimmed, an off-script conversation no microphone had captured. Whatever it was, those who were there said it changed everything. And that one final exchange, the words shared after the applause, would make the moment immortal. The next morning, the clip was everywhere again. But this time, it wasn't just the shock or the spectacle that people were replaying. It was the aftermath, the stillness, the grace. And when Jasmine Crockett finally broke her silence, her words became the emotional heartbeat of the entire story. Standing before a small press crowd, she smiled softly. "What happened on that stage," she said, "wasn't about politics. It was about choice. The choice to see each other not as enemies but as people. And I want to thank Congresswoman Boebert, not for agreeing with me but for choosing dignity." Her voice carried a calm authority, the kind that didn't rise but resonated. "In this job," she continued, "it's easy to get addicted to outrage. It's easy to confuse noise for power. But power without grace is just emptiness wearing a microphone. And last night, we all got to see what happens when grace finally speaks louder." For a moment there was no applause, just reflection. Reporters exchanged glances. Cameramen lowered their rigs, because what Crockett was saying wasn't just commentary, it was confession and invitation. The narrator's voice rose over slow, swelling strings, the kind of cinematic score that carries both ache and hope. In a time when America feels like two stories refusing to meet, two women dared to write a third, one built from courage, the other from compassion. And for one rare night, those stories didn't clash, they converged. Images of the debate flickered across screens, the studio lights, the stunned faces, the standing ovation. Then the montage widened. Veterans shaking hands at rallies, school kids debating respectfully in classrooms, families at dinner tables talking, really talking. "It turns out," the narration continued, "that strength isn't how loud we shout or how fast we fire back. It's how deeply we listen. It's the steadiness to stand tall without striking first. It's the grace to stay kind in a room built for conflict." Cut to Jasmine walking through the marble halls of Congress, reporters calling after her. She doesn't stop, she smiles. Then Boebert back in her district, shaking hands with constituents who look at her differently now, curious, not combative. "We live in a country of rival truths and restless hearts," the voice says. "But somewhere between noise and silence, anger and apology, there's a space we've almost forgotten how to enter. It's called understanding." As the music swells, the visuals slow, shots of bridges, flags in sunlight, the glimmer of dawn over quiet streets. "America was never meant to be perfect," the narration adds. "It was meant to be practiced day by day, debate by debate, apology by apology. And maybe, just maybe, that's what happened that night. Two leaders didn't just bridge a divide, they reminded us it can still be done." A final clip of Crockett at the podium, her closing words from that press conference echoing softly. "If we want to heal, we have to start by hearing." The screen fades to black, a heartbeat, then the faint sound of applause, not roaring, not explosive, but steady like waves. Text appears: "Dignity, courage, grace, these are still American values." And just as the music fades, The voice returns one last time, quiet, resolute, certain. The moment was never about politics. It was about possibility. And what came next would prove that possibility can become power. The camera fades back in slow, deliberate, to the quiet hum of applause still echoing in memory. The lights dim. The narrator's voice returns, low and steady, carrying both warmth and conviction. Lauren Boebert thanked Jasmine Crockett for bridging divides, and the world applauded. A pause, the sound of a heartbeat beneath the music. In a nation that's grown used to shouting, two women prove that the loudest sound isn't always the angriest one. Sometimes, it's the silence that follows understanding, the quiet that heals more than it hurts. Images flash across the screen. Crockett's calm smile, Boebert's softened eyes, the studio on its feet. Then families watching on their phones, teachers replaying the clip in classrooms, strangers nodding at one another in airports. Maybe this is where it begins, the voice continues, growing firmer. Not in Congress, not on cable news, but right here with all of us choosing dignity when it's hardest and respect when it's rare. The screen fills with viewer comments scrolling upward. This gave me hope. Finally, something real. We need more of this. So if you felt something watching this, the narration urges, don't let it fade when the credits roll. Share this story. Start a conversation. Be part of the movement that reminds America what listening sounds like. The music swells, strings rising, light breaking through darkness. The final line lands like a promise, clear and cinematic. Because when dignity stands tall, everyone rises. The screen fades to black, then softly white text appears. Subscribe, share, stand for grace. A final heartbeat, then silence.